Collective Talent Funding, and Ewan Nicholas, who is our Senior Strategy Advisor. I'm really glad to welcome you all to today's session, and thank you very much for giving up your time to attend. The changes we're making to our training grant terms and conditions are substantial and they're significant. And together with the increase we've made to the stipend for students, they are intended to ensure that postgraduate research is both accessible to a wide range of people and they are fully supported to their full potential. Through the webinar, we want to give you an overview of the changes we're making to our training grant terms and conditions, but more importantly, provide you with the space to ask questions of us and for us to respond to them. Given the time constraints, we'll only be taking questions in the areas that we're changing in the terms and conditions, but we're always open to engaging on wider questions that you may have through our usual channels. When we get to the questions, we're going to try and attempt to group the questions around a number of themes, starting with the responsibilities section and then leave. If you don't get your questions in, please don't worry. We intend to circulate a document answering all the questions about the training grant terms and conditions together with the slides next week. We are going to be recording the webinar, and I think that's the sound you just should have heard a couple of minutes ago, and we will circulate the link afterwards. We therefore do ask you to make sure that you don't share any details that would identify other individual students in your questions or other individuals. In a minute, I'm just going to hand over to Chris, who is going to start giving that overview of the changes that we've made. But I just want to give an opportunity to flag, I think that we've got a survey, so I think a colleague is just going to mention that particularly. Oh, there we go. So we've got a quick question as if by magic it's come up. So please could you just respond to that? It's us just really helping us understand how successful both the documentation we provided before and this webinar is in helping you understand the changes that we're making. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Francis. I'll just wait for the slides to come up. So the training grant terms and conditions govern UKRI's relationship with the ROs that fund, the doctoral training that we're trying to provide, and it makes it clear what our commitments are to our students. That said, we also know that what we do is often used as a guide by the rest of the sector to support students who aren't funded by us. And the changes to our terms and conditions really form part of the commitment that we've made for the new deal for PGR. And on this slide, you can see a quote from our CEO, Otterlin, which was in the front of our response to the new deal call for input that we ran. And that set out the actions that we were going to take as both a funder and a convener in the sector. And it sets out our ambition to ensure that all students get a really high quality experience with the right level of financial support, and that the training programs that we fund are flexible enough to be open to people from diverse backgrounds and to meet the different needs of different people. What is really important, and we hope you take away from the webinar today, is that these changes are not just about technical compliance. We really want our students to be well supported and to be able to complete their degrees as part of their studentships. And if you want to see the response in more detail, you can see it on our website. So the next slide just is a really quick summary of the process we've gone through to develop the policies that you can see in the documentation. Key for us is that our terms and conditions changes have been developed through an evidence-based collaborative process. So we've really drawn on the lived experiences of students and the experience and expertise of the sector as a whole. So this started with the New Deal call for input, where we got over 400 responses. We commissioned Advance HE to do a really detailed analysis of the existing terms and conditions from an EDI perspective, and comparing the EDI support that's available to employees with what we have currently. And we also commissioned the UKRI EDI caucus to research the impact of the current support on students, and that included focus groups that they ran with students. And then we brought all of that input together and we recruited a panel of 30 sector experts to advise us on the changes we were proposing to make and the underlying assumptions for those, so we could have some confidence on what we were proposing. And I'm now going to hand over to Ewan, who's going to talk through some of those key changes.
Thanks, Chris. So what I'm going to do now is, as Chris says, canter through quite quickly some of the key changes. It's worth saying these are the key changes. If you want to see all of the changes, do click on that link that Lucy has shared in the chat function. The policy statement gives you chapter and verse on exactly what's happening. In the front of that is a checklist for you that will help you navigate those changes. There is also the annotated changes, the annotated version of the standard terms and conditions of training grant that shows you exactly what's changing. So those are really helpful resources. The first section of the training grant conditions is this. It's on accountability and responsibilities of the research organisation. And we are changing that section to make clear our expectation that in delivering training, you're consistent not just with the kind of financial management rules or the governance around research, but also the regulatory and the legal frameworks that exist to support really high quality training. So we're doing that in a number of ways. The key points are that as well as sort of general provision that we expect you to consider and be compliant with everything that's on you, that you look at consumer law and you have regard to consumer law. That means treating students in a way that is transparent and clear and fair. If you need more advice on what that looks like, the Competition and Markets Authority has a really good document setting out the kinds of information that you need to give students to stay on the right side of the law. There is a link to that in the policy statement. We also want providers to be clear on mechanisms for resolving student complaints and, crucially, having regard to the Ombudsman guidance on those subjects. We know many of you will have complaints processes in place, yet the feedback that we sometimes get is students don't feel that they can raise complaints. They don't feel that they can complain about their supervisor, and when the research that we commissioned indicated some felt they were fighting the system. Particularly if you're in England and Wales, the OIA's good practice framework is terrific on these issues. It's not just about formal complaints, it's about how you can do lots of things that will really support a healthy research culture. Final comment on this is that there is also a requirement there that if you also employ your students, that you formalise that in a written form. Do make sure that you're looking at that. Perhaps the biggest set of changes that we're making in some ways are to leave. We have substantially rewritten the leave section in the training grant conditions. There are now 4 major types of leave that are available. There is annual leave, family leave, medical leave, and additional leave. Annual leave remains essentially unchanged. You must offer between 30 and 40 days. You can pick, within that scope how much a student should get each year, but we haven't made any changes to that. The family leave section we have rewritten, although there aren't that many substantial changes to the policy, certainly in terms of maternity leave or paternity leave, or what we're also calling partners leave. But there are some changes, particularly where perhaps unfortunate things happen in the course of a pregnancy, where we've tried to provide additional support. For medical leave, that's where we are starting to make some really substantial changes. Presently, you can offer 13 weeks of sick leave. Under the new rules, when they start, that will be 28 weeks of medical leave within a rolling 12-month period, capped at 52 weeks across the year. We also have currently a requirement for a medical certificate in certain circumstances. We are lifting our requirements, so we will not require a medical certificate. But no, that doesn't mean that you don't have to or can't require a medical certificate. Instead, what we say is, if your students are using leave, you have to make sure, you have to be reasonably satisfied that they're using it appropriately, that they're genuinely not studying, that they're using it for the purpose that was intended. By removing our requirement, what we're trying to do is give you, as institutions, a lot more flexibility about how you can do that. And what we're hoping is that, particularly for students with perhaps chronic conditions, where sometimes that's been interpreted as having to, kind of reprove a condition, or there might be other cases as well, where actually, as an institution, you have a policy that says we need to provide leave. You have the flexibility to do that. The other key change is that for medical leave, family leave, and additional leave, you need to record it in some form. That was sort of always implied, now it's a formal requirement. How you do so is up to you. We know that there's a whole variety of different approaches out there, from universities that have procured specific systems to help them doing this, to others that do it through, email, spreadsheets, and so forth. We don't mind so long as it works. The other key relationship to leave is extensions. The evidence told us that students weren't taking leave because they thought they couldn't get an extension, that in some cases they were then actually getting quite sick because they weren't doing this, and then they needed more leave. This is in nobody's interest. It's not in our interest or your interest or the student's interest. So we're trying to be much clearer on where we expect extensions to apply. So a studentship, that's the UKRI funding, can be extended for the student if they take medical leave or family leave or additional leave. It must be extended if they take over a month of leave. You may extend it if they take over 1 week of eligible leave. There are clearer limits on allowable extensions. They're all in the rules as well. And we're trying to give you as project leads more certainty on how to manage that grant. Unlike the stipends, as we've done in the last couple of years with stipends where we have topped up budgets where that's been necessary, we're not topping up everybody's budget here, essentially because most grants underspend anyway. So there's very little point in us, giving you a small amount of extra funding just for you to return it to us down the line. But what we are saying is that if there genuinely isn't that money in the grant to support the leave, the student should still get the leave, and we'll work out how to support the funding of that. Last few points. Support for disabled students. We know that in some cases there are really quite long delays in students getting reasonable adjustments put in place. It's not really acceptable. So we've got a new requirement that students are told of the availability of reasonable adjustments at the earliest opportunity, for instance, in their offer letter. That, like all of these requirements, comes in from the 1st of October this year. So any offer letter that you send after the 1st of October must include that notice. Of course, I would encourage you to think about whether you can include it in offer letters that you might be presently sending out, but that isn't a formal requirement. We're also making it easier for you by amending our Disabled Students Allowances Framework, the DSA framework. We are removing our requirement for medical evidence. We're becoming much more reliant on the needs assessment. We're also allowing costs to be eligible once a studentship is offered, which means that you can get the needs assessment in place, and you can pay for that, and you can recover the cost of that from us. But the needs assessment can happen before the studentship starts, if that's the appropriate thing to do. And you can even get some of those adjustments, start getting those into place as well. Final few things I just want to highlight. We are removing a lot of our requirements on changes to mode of study. That's whether a student is part-time or full-time. We don't necessarily think that that means that you have to approve every single application you get to change a student's mode of study, but we want to let you have the ability to make those decisions and to take a considered approach. We're saying that stipends must be operated on or around the 1st of October each year. That, in fact, was always our intent. Most institutions do that already, although we know that small numbers have operated in a slightly different way. And if you have students on your books who still require a COVID-19 extension, at this point these are likely to be part-time students, you must agree that extension by the 1st of October. And again, look at the document for more information on that. There are some other changes. Please do go and have a look at that checklist and at the policy statement. But hopefully what we will do through these is create a much more supportive environment. Chris, I'm going to pass back to you now.
Thanks, Ewan. So the changes that we've made apply to all UKRI trainee grants, doesn't matter which council issued them in the next academic year, and to all the studentships that are active from, as part of the next academic year that are supported by those grants. So it doesn't matter if the studentship starts in October, starts in 2026, or has been running for a couple of years, these conditions will apply. And one of the reasons that we're doing all of the publications and comms now is because the panel that I mentioned earlier that we recruited felt that some universities may need to update their regulations in order to support these terms and conditions changes. So obviously we want to provide enough forward notice of those changes. It's really, I'm sure you all know that we have expectations that when we update our terms and conditions, they then get applied to everybody. That doesn't mean that you revisit decisions that you've already made. So it's really important to apply the rules that were in place at the time that that decision was made. So if you've got a student who has taken unpaid leave because it went over the current 13 weeks, that is unfortunate, but you wouldn't reimburse them, because had they taken that leave in like 8 months' time, they would have got paid leave. It's not retrospective in that respect. And then just on co-funding, so we're much clearer through the changes. We strengthened our expectations of the contributions that co-funding partners should be making to providing support, but that is for new collaborative agreements, and being realistic about how long it takes collaborative agreements to be negotiated. We've said that is for agreements for students who start in 2026, as in the 26-27 academic year. We're not expecting you to revise existing arrangements and, you know, start renegotiating 2025 agreements that are about to be signed. We would encourage you to approach your existing funding partners to see if they'll support it. Anecdotally, some of them are actually really supportive of this. But if you do find your partners under existing arrangements aren't able to provide additional costs, then you can draw the funding from the UKRI grant. So on the costs, which is on the next slide, we expect that around that our doctoral spend is probably going to increase by around 1.2%, and that's less than the amount of money that we get back through underspend at the end of training grants overall. The cost of leave obviously isn't accrued at the time leave is taken. It's at the end of a studentship if they're provided an extension. And because of that, as well as the underspend that I mentioned there, we won't be giving you additional funding each time an extension is agreed. What we'll do is we'll wait till the end of the grant's lifetime and look at the cumulative impact of all the additional support you've provided across all of the studentships that are provided by that training grant, alongside the underspend. And if there's a discrepancy between those numbers, we'll work with you to work out how that funding gap is covered. The benefits of the changes that we expect is we expect fewer terminations of studentships. So it's currently around 13%, and we're estimating it will reduce to around 9%. It should reduce late submissions. So about 80% of all the students currently submit their thesis outside of their funding period. And it's about 1.3 times more likely if the student identifies as disabled. EDICA, which is that caucus I mentioned earlier, found that the current support contributes to negative mental health, and there's this vicious circle that people take leave and get stressed about the amount of paid leave they can have, and then that can mean they need more sick leave because their mental health deteriorates. So we're hoping these changes will break that cycle and actually keep students studying in study for longer. And the reforms will also help provide a clearer framework for consistency and compliance. So the last slide lists a number of the next steps that we're going to take, and I won't bore you by reading all of those out in detail. There are also a number of recommendations that the revised T's and C's don't address. So if you look at the analysis the Advanced HE report does, is about 70 different recommendations. So we're currently considering at what pace we look at that work and balance that against allowing the current changes to bed in. And also, you know, there's lots of other aspects of UKRI doctoral investment that require our attention. So we'll be balancing across a number of priorities. So if you haven't already done so, Lucy's going to post into the chat the link to sign up to our newsletter, and that is the best way to learn about new developments and to receive invites to future webinars. So I'd really encourage you to do that if you haven't. And that's, you'll be pleased to hear, is the last slide of the presentation. So we're now going to move on to the Q&A session, which Frances is going to chair.
Great, thanks Chris and Ewan. So we've got about 40 minutes for the Q&A. We've had quite a high number of pre-submitted questions, and I can see we've got some number of questions building in the Q&A section. on Zoom. So what we will try and do is get through as many as possible. As I said at the beginning, we're going to group these, so please don't worry that if we're not taking them in the order that you're seeing them. And as I said, we will be providing a full recording of this session, but also providing a response to each of the questions that we receive, even if we're not able to respond to them. So the first section is actually focusing on responsibilities, and I'm going to direct this one to Ewan. So Sonia asks whether we think the bulk of the changes are likely to be primarily for the training grant or the research organisation to deliver.
Thanks, Francis. So that's a good question. I think at one level we're actually fairly relaxed about how research organisations choose to organise themselves. We actually fund quite a large range of different types of organisations. Some of you are very large and complex, some of you are rather smaller. So really what we would do is we would encourage you to operate in a way that fits your needs. That all said, in many institutions, it might well make sense to ensure that there are policies that apply to all UKRI funded students rather than trying to do it grant by grant. That's particularly the case when you're looking at some of those kind of responsibilities that, with a legal responsibility, the onus is on the whole organisation, and where actually many of the kind of high level requirements are the same as they are on undergraduates. So you will have experts who are used to dealing with those, even if the application to PhD students, to PGR students is slightly different. Even if it's the case that it is at a university or an RO level, remember our expectation is that you then apply that at the grant level. So there is still a role for the project leads or the training grant holders to do, and even supervisors and other staffs who have an important role. If students don't get the right information about, say, reasonable adjustments or something like that, then it's a problem for the student, but it's a liability for the organisation. So it's important to get these things right.
Thank you, Ewan. And I've just got one more that will fall under this question, this section, which is from Lindsay. It says, in relation to complaints, how do students complain about UKRI's terms and conditions? So if the RO has to implement a condition which the student feels unfair, and she said she just wasn't quite clear from the UKRI website. Really good question.
So that is a very good question. So if a student's complaint would generally be to the RO about the implementation of the support that they provide. What we've tried to do in making these changes is to give you a lot more flexibility as ROs, so that the decision making is in your hands, which kind of reflects that legal structure. UKRI does have a complaints process. We wouldn't accept a complaint from a student about, if you like, the support that the university or the RO had afforded them, but we would accept, I think, a complaint about, the overall UKRI policy, if that was within the structure of the complaints policy, meaning that we had not delivered against our own legal commitments, for instance.
Thanks, Ewan. And so in the first instance, I would suggest that you raise that with the individual council that's funding the studentships. But if you're not comfortable or happy with how that's been resolved, then I think on our website, we've got what the formal process is for making that complaint, and we can share that as part of the written responses. Okay, so the next question that we've got relates to leave, and it's from Cara regarding changes to leave provision. Will all leave be paid? So thinking, she's got an example here about carer leave and at what level. Ewan, that's for you.
Sorry, yes, I will. I'll take that question. So yeah, so leave is pretty much in all cases paid. The only exceptions are there's an option for some unpaid parental leave and for the later stages of maternity leave. But otherwise, leave is paid, whether it's annual leave, family leave, medical leave, or additional leave, and for the full period of a phased return too. And it would be paid at the student's normal level. So say a student is on an enhanced stipend of 22 grand a year. They would receive it at that same rate throughout their period of leave. There is a slight difference between leave and the suspension of the studentship, not the suspension of the student, which is different. So if you suspend the studentship, which is the UKRI funding, then obviously no funding is being drawn from the grant for that. But whenever a student is on leave, the studentship is not suspended and you can continue paying the stipend.
Thanks, Ewan. I've got another couple of questions on leave. The first one is, when do the new leave provisions come into effect? Is there an option to adopt them earlier for cases of a current student with chronic medical conditions? And I'm not just picking on Ewan, I'm going to him because when I said about thematically grouping them, leave is the section that Ewan's going to pick up. So just I'm not being unfair as chair. Ewan, over to you on that one.
So our new rules and what we pay for will come in from the start of the academic year. There is a bit of leeway for you there because we understand that one, that you will need to change, or you may need to change your university regulations if you have those, and that would start at the start of your academic year, and that that you might have relatively little flexibility for doing that. But otherwise you have to apply the rules that are in place at the time. So you can't, or we will not fund leave now under the new rules. We will only do that from the start of the academic year.
Thanks, Ewan. So the next one in relation to leave is, and this is from Kerry, is there any more clarity around phased return being taken from hours of annual leave accrued during their period of leave?
Yeah, so that's me again. So phased return, they've been part of the system for a while, actually. They've been in the guidance previously, but we are now bringing them into the training grant conditions themselves. And we're also saying that phased return is available, not just for medical leave, but potentially you could use it for family leave or additional leave as well. So because we have a cap on extensions, it's really important that phased returns are accounted for somewhere in that leave framework. If a student has medical leave allocation left or additional leave or family leave, then use that, which is often how it works in a kind of workplace setting as well. It does beg the question, though, of what happens if you have a student who has used their full allocation of, say, medical leave, and they are returning to study and they need a phased return. How would you manage that? And what we suggested is, in those circumstances, actually, you might want to use annual leave. So if a student had used their full allocation, that means they've already been off for half a year, for 28 weeks. Even if you don't sort of record annual leave particularly well, generally, you could probably say, well, within that 28 weeks, they would have accrued about 15 to 20 days of annual leave, depending on your own rules. And therefore, you could use that to support a phased return. And potentially then you could have sort of 2 periods of phased return. You can also supplement any of our rules with your own resources as well, of course.
Thanks, Ewan. So one of the changes you flagged in the presentation was about changing requirement around evidence for medical leave. And so there's a question from Louise. Is there any information on the specific evidence that can be accepted by UKRI for students applying for medical leave? And I think Lee also asked if repeated medical evidence would be required for mental health issues.
Yeah, so this is a really important question because actually I think the sector's understanding of this has been evolving over the last few years and particularly rapidly. What we're looking at, what we're looking for is for you as institutions to have a policy and then to stick to it, essentially. So we require that you make sure that leave is used for its intended purpose. That might mean that it is entirely appropriate still in some circumstances to require a medical certificate or a letter from a GP, but you have flexibility to look at that. When we asked our panel about this across the summer, we had some responses which said, that's great, this is what we do already, and this is lines to it, which was brilliant. We also had some responses that sort of said, not sure about this seems a bit new. But actually, when we went and did a bit more desk research and had a look at what they were offering, often they were already in line with this as well. So I do recommend that you go away and you talk to, or you look at the policy of your institution already, because probably you've already got quite a sensible approach to this somewhere.
Thanks, Ewan. So staying on the topic of leave, when you say a week of leave, does this have to be consecutive? We often see shorter periods more frequently over the year and just under the week block, but can obviously rack up over time.
No, it doesn't have to be consecutive.
Okay, thanks, Ewan. Again, another one on leave. I promise we will get to other areas. This will be the final question on leave. Richie said, additional leave and extended sick pay. How do UKRI expect HEIs to provide equitable access to extended funding for visa holders? So the proportion of our international students. Yeah,
so UKRI now funds or allows something like up to 30% are studentships to be offered to international students. So we expect you as research organisations to meet all of the legal and regulatory requirements on you, and that includes the requirements as to set down by UK Visas and Immigration, UKVI. So as ROs, you might have to accept that complying with those rules means that some international students don't have the same access to leave as home students. And where that's the case, it's really important that you're transparent with those students. We don't currently have a condition that would require you to stop paying a stipend for a student who needs to return to their home nation, provided they intend to return and complete their studies. But the onus is on you to consider any other kind of legal ramification from that, or any other legal or regulatory obligations you might have. And we've also asked you to remind students that they might be in a different legal context. So it's generally assumed that the stipend isn't taxed in the UK. We simply don't know whether that will be the case in other nations, and there's a sort of onus on the student to go away and make sure that they are compliant there.
Great. Thanks, Ewan. And you'll be glad the spotlight of answering questions is moving from you for a moment. We're now moving to a theme which is around extensions. So Chris is going to, I think, reply to a few of these. The first one is from Richard. Do funding extensions greater than 1 year still apply? For example, if ESRC or another council has already agreed them?
Yeah, so there's two aspects to this. So if you have already had a decision made by a council to, by exception, fund an extension that's greater than a year, then that still applies. It's not going to get taken back from you, and we'd suggest that the student would quite legitimately raise a complaint if you tried to take it away from them, and there's whole issue rights under consumer law around that. The standard terms and conditions, so the standard terms and conditions don't supersede any written agreement you've already received or you receive from us in the future. And also bear in mind that if your grant offer or the award letter has specific conditions that relate to this, then you need to maintain those, and that's set out in TGC 1. On that note, we got a question around whether specific conditions and what to do if specific conditions contradict standard conditions. So your specific conditions should always supersede any standard conditions. So if councils have added additional conditions, they take precedence. But I would say that as part of the terms and conditions changes, we've made it much clearer where funding extensions beyond a year is fine, and we wouldn't really consider it an exception. So the most common example is if someone goes on maternity leave, they're going to use that 12 months just on maternity leave. If they happen to have sick leave on top, then before you'd have to apply to us as an exception, and it just all gets a bit complicated. So we're trying to get rid of some of these bureaucratic loopholes to make it easier for everyone.
Thanks, Chris. So the next one is around training grant terms and conditions 6.1.1, and I won't do a test for you to recite what that one is. So I'm going to say it's and policy statement 3.79. So it's in considering the length of an extension, we say you may consider the impact of the timing and duration of the absence. So they're asking, will there be any additional guidance about how to apply this? Because it is open to interpretation and may lead, their concern, maybe it'll lead to some inconsistencies across the network. Maybe you could just unpack that a little bit, Chris, and some of our intent there. Yeah,
so it is something that we're thinking about, as we're writing the guidance to accompany this, which, we're hoping to be able to publish soon. What we're just really conscious of is it's all very well to say someone was off sick for a week with flu, but actually if they were due to spend that week at, say, an international facility, it might take them several weeks to get back to that international facility. So the impact can outweigh the amount of time the student was actually unavailable to study, and that is something that we would like people to bear in mind. And it might be you can do without that international experiment and find other ways around it. So it's important that other mitigations are considered, but we just want to be open and flexible in the general manner of the TG changes to just be a bit more supportive.
Thanks, Chris. So Maria's asked about the management of financial risk in the case of eligible extensions, including studentships co-funded by industry.
So when it comes to co-funding, I think it's really important that I mean, I think we all recognise it, but it can get a bit lost. Studentships are not the same as contracted research. It's a training position, it's not a service to the industry, for example. And so when a university sets up their collaboration agreement with co-funders, they need to consider the nature of the studentship, the fact that it's supporting a person, and the types of support that they expect might be needed during that studentship, and that the co-funder takes their fair share of providing that. So arrangements for cost increases, the increasing stipends and fees throughout the studentship, the possible need for extensions are just some of the aspects we would expect you to include as part of the negotiation up front of that collaboration agreement. There are some co-funders who we recognise can only offer a fixed price contribution, and that's fine. We don't have a minimum contribution of project partners to studentships, but what will be important is that then you update the percentage contribution they are actually making to the costs. So if the costs go up and it's fixed, obviously their percentage contribution goes down. And then the grant condition 8.4.1, because I noted it down, sets out those expectations about equitable support of partners from 2026, as I mentioned in the presentation.
Okay. Thanks, Chris. We're going to move now to a slightly different area, which is the funding of the changes that we're making. So we've got a question from Sarah, which is, what are the implications for budgets regarding measures introduced which could potentially cost more? So stipends, paying stipends during medical leave. We've had quite a few questions about the stipend. Pauline has also asked, will there be a top up to cover the 25-26 uplift, and also whether there are any changes around the London waiting or other uplifts. So broad package of questions there around how is the funding been, what are the implications of the additional costs and where those costs are being met.
So on the stipend uplifts specifically, as in previous years, we're not planning to reduce student recruitment for the 25-26 academic year to pay for that. We will be contacting ROs shortly to confirm the additional funding for live grants to cover that uplift. In terms of future years, UKRI, like other parts of government, is currently in the middle of a spending review exercise. So we don't actually have any confirmed budgets for any of our activities for 26, 27 and beyond. But as Sarah recognises, we know the costs of students are increasing, stipends and all those other things. And as we mentioned in the presentation, the cost increases associated with these changes. What the work we've done to model all these financial implications has allowed us to do is to include all those considerations as part of our spending review bid. And then the budgets that actually get allocated, once our UKRI knows its overall allocation, our executive committee will be able to decide how that's allocated across the councils, knowing what's happening to the unit cost of studentships. And we're going to wait until we know what that allocation looks like to make any further decisions about stipends. So we can't tell you any more about how we're going to set the stipend for 2026 onwards. Though I would flag, we've already made a public commitment for it to be at least equivalent to the take-home pay of national living wage. So we're not going to take that away. Outside of those changes, I just flag we are planning to undertake a piece of work to better understand the full economic cost of PGR. So that we can more holistically look at the full funding package for PGR. And that's where things like the future of London waiting is going to come in, because we're just going to roll it up into a big package of lots of funding questions that we've got.
Thanks, Chris, and you did well because I packed in quite a few questions there. I've got a couple coming in which are relation to studentships where there's industrial or other co-funding partners, so I might take those together. So if a company is paying 50% of a UKRI studentship from September 26, will they have to agree to fund 50% of parental leave and paid sick leave when they sign a collaboration agreement? That's from Amanda. And a kind of in a similar spirit from David is when a student receives an enhanced stipend, for example, from industry, would the expectation be that sick leave is paid at the enhanced rate? And if so, would the company be expected to pay that additional funding, or could it be taken from the grant?
So students, when they take paid leave, should take that paid leave at the rate that they are normally paid. So if they're on an enhanced stipend, that is what they should be receiving their paid leave at. And I think the wording of the TGCs supports that, but we can also make sure it's in the guidance. For co-funders, we have said that we expect from 26 the collaborative agreements reflect an equitable split of responsibility, essentially, for the additional costs. So we would generally expect in that 50% case that the additional support is split 50-50. However, as I said, there are cases where co-funders would have fixed contributions and things like that. So the percentage contribution can change over time. It really depends how you choose as the university to negotiate and set up that collaborative agreement. We just want to make sure when you do the studentship record, it's accurately reflecting the contribution they are actually making to the studentship.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I think the final question in this area is, and it's from Ying, how would additional funding be considered for UKRI if more medical leave will be taken due to this change? So just thinking about that cumulatively this cost could build up in grants over and above their current funding.
Yeah, so as I said in the presentation, we would consider this at the end of the grant. I mean, generally, especially if you're, I mean, our training grants support a whole diversity of students, right from 1 to hundreds on a single grant. The bigger the grant, the more you should be planning in some contingency that some students are going to get ill and that some students are going to need extensions for various reasons. But that said, we know that things can happen and the additional support might go beyond any contingency planning you're doing, or you don't have the flex. So as I said, we've still got that condition that we can look at topping up the grant at the end if we're content that that money's eligible and you haven't quite got enough to meet the needs.
Thanks, Chris. And we do recognise, as you said in the presentation, we've got a lot of large multi-cohort grants with larger numbers of students, but we do still have a number of grants with even one student on them where there is that less flexibility. Okay, I think that comes to the end of the questions we've got around funding. I want to turn now to the area of kind of the changes we're making in relation to disability support, and this time the spotlight's turning to Ewan. So the first questions that I've got actually came in both from somebody called Jennifer, so that's quite a coincidence. Can you provide any clarification of application of training grant terms and conditions 3.4.5? Do requirements about eligible DSA costs, anticipatory reasonable adjustments, etc. apply to studentship offers made from spring 2025? So it's just thinking about how those changes that we're making to DSA costs and anticipatory adjustments apply.
Yes, so TGC 3.4.5 is about reasonable adjustments, and it reminds ROs that you must ensure that you tell students about the availability of reasonable adjustments at the earliest opportunity through offer letters. We're also saying that you have to have a policy in place to make sure that you can provide reasonable adjustments and that we expect you to do so. We do get quite a lot of feedback that reasonable adjustments are not made or are not made in a timely fashion. So it is really important that these are addressed. If you look at the Equalities and Human Rights Commission guidance for higher education, again, that says that actually if you don't provide reasonable adjustments, that is discrimination. So it is problematic if that is not happening. So like all of our requirements, these must be in place from the 1st of October. So to be compliant with all our training grant conditions, any offer letter sent after the 1st of October must contain that information. That's the offer letter that is sent to the student. I saw there's a question on that in the chat. That said, we would encourage you to put it into offer letters as soon as possible. The really important thing to note here is that the onus for making reasonable adjustments is on you as institutions. So we've tried to set out that we want to be supportive. We're trying to be supportive through the DSA, where we provide additional funding, and through the training grant conditions, where we've set out changes that we will make. But really, the onus is on you to make a decision as to what is reasonable. That might mean that you end up funding some stuff that actually isn't within our conditions. If you see a tension between what we provide and what you think should be provided, we require you to report that to us, which is there to provide a mechanism to kind of close the loop. So if you think there are reasonable things that we are not funding, we can look at it and then go, well, actually, is there some things that we've missed here? So we are trying to be as supportive as we can, whilst also reflecting, again, that onus is on you as research organisations.
Okay, thanks, Ewan. Staying on the topic of DSA costs, Lee asks, can you provide some clarity around eligible DSA costs that can be charged from the point of offer?
Yeah, so this is, again, that change that we said we'll make in the policy statement, and we'll be updating the DSA framework in due course, which will allow, so costs currently can't be charged until the studentship has started, and we say that actually they can be charged from offer. The aim is essentially to allow you to put in place that needs assessment if a needs assessment is needed before the studentship has started. And then you can also start to bring in those reasonable those adjustments, those costs that are associated with the DSA. So the DSA framework sits as a separate document on our website. We'll provide a link when we write around after this email, and it tells you what costs are eligible. As I said, we are updating those costs. We are allowing more costs to become eligible. There's no limit per se on what you can pay for before the studentship has started. But what we do say is we expect you, with your advice from your disability office, to use your judgment as to what's appropriate. And if the student doesn't start wherever reasonable, you might need to take some steps to recover some of those costs. Again, the details in the policy statement.
Okay, thanks, Ewan. So I'm now moving into a new bucket, which is everything that didn't fit neatly into the other kind of thematic groupings that we've got. So I might be moving around who I target questions at. The first one that I'd like to start with is from Paul. What plans does UKRI have for post-implementation review of the changes? Thinking particularly about picking up unintended or unanticipated consequences of the changes. Ewan, can I direct that one to you?
Yeah, so we are developing an evaluation framework, and what we're looking at is all the different sources of information we get from our colleagues in councils. You will know that when we announced these changes, we also said that we will be retiring the GES student data portal. We will be replacing that with something, so that will give us some hopefully better data that we can look at. We're going to be monitoring the costs of this quite carefully. If you read the full document, you'll see at the back end we did try and establish what we think the costs are likely to be. So we will be testing that and monitoring to see where they lead. On things like disabled students' allowances, we essentially think we aren't being charged enough, that there is probably some way to go and what actually we should be paying for that to be a really effective policy. So it's not necessarily a case that we don't want to put money behind this. We are actually quite willing to put this money in to get the outcomes that we're seeking to achieve.
Okay, thank you, Ewan. So one issue that's been raised both here and from time to time is our rules on submission rates and RA rules on maximum periods of registration. Can you comment on that? And again, I'm going to be pointing that to Ewan just because I know he's been having a number of discussions with institutions on this, so it makes sense.
Yeah, so it's interesting. This is one that's been coming up. We've been out and about talking in a lot of forums, and this is an issue that does crop up from time to time. So this work that we're talking about today, this is particularly focused on the UKRI studentship. That is the period that we're funding. And what we're saying is that in the cases set out in the training grant conditions, if something goes wrong, we expect you to extend the studentship. So more funding is available. It's true that we don't currently have across UKRI a harmonised position on what date should be recorded in GES as the expected submission date. So different councils have slightly different approaches to that. We've not looked at that in detail as part of this review, but it is certainly something that is on our radar and that we're hoping to look at in the near future. That said, all councils have had the expectation since at least 2018 that students' projects should be set in a way that allows submission within the funded studentship. And if the studentship is extended, then the funding end date obviously moves, and as does our expectation of when the expected submission date would be. So I hope that's clear. So this means that the changes we're making will make it easier to extend the expected submission date. You're likely to need to update the submission date. Currently, recorded on JES if you provide a student with an extension. So those two things. There might also be an impact on your RO's maximum period of registration date. Our current understanding is that ROs have quite a wide variety of approaches to that, to the rules that govern that maximum periods. So if our rules do impact your date, you might need to look at that, but that's not something we can provide guidance on because it doesn't come from our rules. It comes from your own regulations. One final point on this, which is we accept that a grace period after the studentship is sometimes necessary, but what's important is that you must not, for example, be advising students that they have what we've sometimes heard called an unfunded writing up year after the end of their studentship, because that wouldn't be consistent with the statements of expectations.
Okay, thank you, Ewan. So we've got a few questions which come at this point from slightly different angles, but it's about, these are really important changes for students themselves to understand. And obviously this is a webinar that's focused on ROs. Could you expand a little bit more on what our expectations about how this will be communicated to students? Somebody's asked, could they share this webinar presentation? So could you just a little bit expand upon what we see as the responsibilities in communicating and any support that we're going to be providing in that?
Yes, shall I pick that one up?
I'm sorry, I didn't give a name then, did I?
I assumed. So
I will give Chris one in a minute.
So the responsibility lies with the research organisation. So because that's actually where a lot of the onus for getting this right lies as well. If, for instance, you have a supervisor who is telling a student that they can't get reasonable adjustments, that is a liability for the university. So you do need to make sure that you are getting that right. That said, what we're looking at is whether we can do anything to support ROs as we communicate this. So we've mentioned in the policy statement, there is a roadmap of the work that we're doing in the future, and from October we're looking at whether we can support, or how we can support, with communications that are directed at students. So rather than this webinar or the standard terms and conditions of training grant, both of which are quite sort of technical and dense and difficult to understand, content that is more appropriate to students. A little bit like the way the Office for Students work, what that is likely to do is set out some key principles, but direct students back to you as institutions for the precise level of support that they themselves get. So if you take annual leave, for instance, we can't say exactly how many days because you have a range that you would need to pick on, for instance. But we are really, really clear that it is really important that students get the support and that there will be some work to support students knowing their rights too.
Okay, thanks, Ewan. So on the ground, it's really important that institutions are thinking about how they communicate these changes, but we are working up how we can really support that. And it might be, we can provide a little bit more of an update on that when we publish the training grant guidance as well, just so you understand what the timeline for some of that is. We've then got a number of questions around international students, which I'm going to see if Chris is able to respond to. So there's a question here, have there been EDI recommendations in the case of overseas students specifically? The person indicates these usually face considerable additional costs, not only to embark on a PhD, both in terms of the visa and health costs, but also after they start their study, for instance, in terms of bringing their family members to the UK. And do we have any advice on this? And then a kind of building from that, how practically could they do a needs assessment before an overseas student starts? I think I'll pause there because there's quite a bit there, but if we've got time, I'll bring in a final question around international students.
So it's a really good question with quite a few knotty answers, and I'm knotty issues, and I'm not going to pretend that I know all of the answers to it. In terms of EDI recommendations, the international students can be supported under our DSA framework in the same as any other student. What I would highlight is what Ewan was saying earlier about there are visa regulations that might impact the ability. So, if they've got a family member who acts as a carer, I can't tell you whether that's going to be allowable under the visa rules and things like that. So it is things that are going to need to be considered. And I honestly don't know what the answer is about the needs assessment. I suspect it depends on the capability of the needs assessment provider as to whether they could do it, because in some cases presumably it could be done virtually and it's possible, but I'm afraid I can't provide any more information than that.
Yeah.
Can
Thanks, Chris.
Can I add one thing as well, which is I think there is something that underpins all of these changes, which is that as grant holders, as research organisations, the UK VI rules apply to you, they don't apply to us. So it's really important that you can look at these frameworks and you can make those judgments yourselves. It's not necessarily the place for UKRI to provide all of that guidance. And we appreciate that that's perhaps a little bit of a culture shift, but we think it's a really important culture shift.
Yeah. Thanks. And what I would say, looking at some of the questions that we haven't been able to respond to, there's obviously a lot of concern for international students. And I think what I would say is a lot of the concerns you expressed are ones that we are aware of. And UKRI does continually work with a range of partners to make sure that we understand what some of the challenges are for international students and international researchers, and can work with colleagues across government to convey those and look at ways in which we might be able to enhance support. But obviously, this lies outside of our direct span of control. So let's just say we will, as we go back through the minutes we've got from this, just check there are additional points that we haven't been able to bring into those discussions, but we will be continuing our work in that space. We just see if there are any other questions. I think we've probably got time for one last question, and it's a little bit of a lucky dip. I'm just going back up a little bit in case we've missed any ones. Okay. So there was a question just around how the recording of leave. So I think it was, where are we? Alana asked whether current record management systems providers are aware of the changes and do they have the capability to make them. So I think thinking particularly about recording of leave, some of the guidance we've given around that.
Yes, that's really good. That's a really good question as well. So as I set out in the presentation, we're not prescribing that you record leave in one way or another. We know that some institutions have sort of software packages that help them do that. We know others don't, provided that it works. We're fairly relaxed about that. There are a number of firms out there that can provide record management systems, ranging from sort of off-the-shelf systems that are really built for kind of managing employees, to bespoke solutions for monitoring PGR progression provided by the sorts of firms that might provide you with kind of research management software, for example. We don't really have a role in commissioning those services. We have been very public with our requirements. We publish them on our website so that they are out there, so that sort of firm can have a look at it. It's up to you whether you use one of those systems. My understanding, a bit limited, is that the challenge for some of those bespoke providers is that every RO, every university has its own requirements reflecting its own university regulations. There's things that we might think are the same, using the same language, but are always looking slightly different. So the more you can do to sort of work together, and I confess to being slightly unclear of the procurement rules here, but to have a consistent ask, the easier you will make life for some of those service providers as well. Great,
thank you, Ewan. So we're reaching the end of our time, so I just wanted to wrap up, and I'm going to sneak one tiny question in there. So a couple of things. One is we have been recording this and we will be making it available. We are also capturing responses to all the questions because I'm conscious we haven't been able to cover them all. We also have a question that this has been really useful, but obviously they're going to be working through these changes over the next couple of months. Are there plans to hold more sessions like this, Ewan?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's three things to note. One is that we will be publishing the guidance in April alongside the DSA framework, which will answer some of the questions I've seen in the chat. The second is sign up to our email list if you haven't already, because we'll be giving all the updates through there. And the third is, yes, there will be another webinar, which we are planning for May.
Thank you. So I'm going to thank Chris and Ewan because we've thrown a lot of questions at them over the last 40 minutes. Also, to remind you, in a minute, just as we're closing the webinar, another poll's going to pop up. We'd be really grateful if you could complete that. We'll circulate the survey as part of the follow-up email that we sent to all the people who registered for the session, which with the slides and other material, as I said. So please, if you can, complete that, but just take the opportunity to really thank you all for your time today. And please do reach out and feel able to reach out and ask any further questions you have about this or more broadly about postgraduate research. Thanks everyone and have a good rest of the day.